Hello, everyone. Welcome to Grasshopper's Bouncing Back in 2021 webinar. Happy New Year, happy January. We're so excited to connect over this webinar. For those of you who don't know me, I am Heather Miller, the founder and CEO of Grasshopper. Grasshopper is a mobile app for female and non-binary mentors and mentees. Our mission is to increase the number of women and diversity talent in leadership roles. On the app, you can build your profile, connect with peers and mentors, share knowledge, learn from role models, gain resources for both professional and personal skill building. In addition to helping our women connect on the platform, we provide a slew of resources on personal and professional development for everyone, regardless of gender, like this webinar. And I wanted to say that we're running today's webinar because we know what a strenuous year we've all had. With COVID, school, work, wrapping up the end of the year, wrapping up end of the year projects, trying to leave last year behind. We're all looking for some coping mechanisms and inspiration for going into 2021. So today we'll be partnering with Chris Bordoni, resilience expert, podcast host, and teacher, as well as Stephanie Harrison, entrepreneur and the founder of The New Happy, to help us all think through our renewal. So a couple of things that we'll tackle. We'll tackle happiness, well-being, overcoming adversity, following your passions, entrepreneurship, and anything else that you want to hear about during our Q&A session. So hopefully you leave this webinar with some tips for taking your life back in the new year. I would love to encourage you to submit some questions for our Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So please do so through the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring throughout, and we'll make sure that we get to your questions if we have time. So without further ado, I would love to welcome our amazing panelists and our Q&A moderator. Could you all tell us a bit about yourselves and your stories?
Sure, I'm happy to start here. So I'm Chris Bordoni, and I guess first of all, thank you to Heather and the Grasshopper team, and thanks to Stephanie for joining, and thank you to all of you for taking an hour to have a conversation about resilience and happiness and trying to make 2021 a fantastic year. So thank you to all of you. A bit of background about myself. So as Heather mentioned, I'm a teacher, I'm a coach, an entrepreneur, and I do host a podcast as well. And I'm incredibly interested in resilience. I'm interested in reinvention and in personal growth. And I got interested in these things through my personal experiences. So there's really two things that came together. So from a professional standpoint, I spent 10 or 12 years working as a management consultant. I worked first with big companies, then I worked with elected officials in local government. And then about 5 years ago, started my own company where I work with nonprofits and foundations. And all of that work was around helping organizations to grow and helping them to change and to transform. And in parallel to that, I went through a number of personal experiences that really changed my thinking and pushed me to grow myself. When I was 17, I had 2 serious shoulder injuries that ended my swimming career. A few years later, I had a serious back injury and was forced to quit my job at one of the big consulting firms. And then a couple of years later, I'd gotten healthy and was working for a different firm and was doing incredibly well. And then had the same injury come back. And so again, had to quit a job that I really loved. And then when I was 30, I had a battle with cancer that frankly, I'm lucky to be here having this conversation. And so all of these experiences really challenged me to think about resilience and how do you survive these events? But maybe more importantly, what do you do in the aftermath? How do you grow? How do you change your life? And how do you reinvent yourself when certain doors close? So I became really passionate about this, and I'm super excited to be having this conversation with you all and can't wait to get into it.
Thanks,
Great,
Chris.
thank you so much. Yeah, Stephanie, feel free to go.
Yeah, I can jump in. Hi, everyone. Again, echoing what Chris said, so grateful to be here with all of you, and thank you for taking the time out of your day. I hope that we will give you ample ample things to think about and time back in the form of greater well-being and greater resilience in the face of all the challenges that we all face in our daily lives. My name is Stephanie, and I'm the founder of The New Happy, which is a company devoted to changing the way that we define happiness as a society. And my background is actually quite similar to Chris's. I started my career as a management consultant. I then spent 5 years working in different roles at LinkedIn, including product marketing, product management, and then ultimately moving into a leadership position. And then most recently, I was in charge of learning and curriculum at Thrive Global, which is a behavior change well-being company, where I developed all of our mental health, resilience, happiness, habit change, behavior change, all of that fun stuff, all of those programs in partnership with institutions like Stanford and Harvard. And I also have a master's degree in the study of positive psychology, where I also was an instructor at the University of Pennsylvania. And everything that I think one thing that Chris and I really share is a desire to take not only personal experience, but then back that up with empirical research. So everything that we talk about has been validated by studies, by research, by testimonials, all of that great stuff. So hopefully we'll be able to share some amazing tips with you all today.
Great, we're so excited to get into it. Lissa, you're up.
Thank you, Heather and the Grasshopper team for having me, and thanks to Chris and Stephanie for joining us this evening. My life is coming a little bit full circle. I actually found Grasshopper through Stephanie, so I'm really excited to be able to be a part of this webinar in particular with Chris and Stephanie. For those of you who haven't had a chance to explore their work or hear from them yet, trust me, you're really in for a treat. I know they've got a lot of great stuff coming up. I write for Grasshopper, and at some point I'm going to stop saying I'm new to the career world, but until then I keep saying I see myself as kind of a career explorer. So I'm a first generation college student, and I have degrees in criminal justice and psychology. I ended up in digital marketing, and I'm actually a business operations specialist currently. Outside of work, I'm super passionate about all the things that Chris and Stephanie are going to talk a little bit about. So positive psychology, resilience, and how it affected me during my college journey, and all of the ways that I can help college students grow and navigate those difficult years entering the real world post-graduation. So thanks for having me, and let's dive in.
Yes, I would love to dive in. Thank you all for those introductions. So just looking at the next slide, I quickly want to talk through our agenda here. So we've just introduced our panelists and our moderator. We will then grab all the tips and tricks we can from Chris and Stephanie on bouncing back in the new year, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A, as I said. So we'll probably leave 10 minutes at the end if we can. So let's dive in. And I think the first question we have is for Chris. So let's get a little bit deeper into resilience, and what is it, and why is it so important for you to teach it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. And there's a lot of different definitions of resilience. I think many of you probably have heard of the definition that resilience is the ability to bounce back. I like a slightly different definition of resilience, which is resilience is the ability to carry out your purpose, to maintain your purpose in the face of radically changed circumstances. So in other words, there's something that matters to you. There's something that's important to you, and life happens. Something happens that changes your world. And resilience is the ability to keep delivering that thing that actually matters to you. And I like that because it suggests that there's purpose to it. There's meaning behind it. It's not just an abstract that allows us to do things we care about. So as far as why I'm interested in resilience, well, I talked to you a little bit about my story and about how I got here. And really resilience was sort of the thing that allowed me to make something out of those experiences. I don't believe I was born with a tremendous amount of resilience. I had many small experiences and some bigger experiences that allowed me to build it over time. And as I built it up, I got to a place where I was able to, go through something like getting really sick and fortunately come out on the other side of it, right? And so it's something that personally is important to me. And I think what the data speak to here, and what I'd love to share is that when you do some research and you look at some of the things that happen in life, the reality is that life is messy, life is complicated, things happen. And so on the left-hand side, what you can see is I did some research on the likelihood of things happening, things like getting really sick, things like becoming divorced, losing your job, getting in a car accident, losing a loved one. And if you look at the rates of these things, then what becomes pretty clear pretty quickly is that, and not to be a downer, but at some point in most people's lives, you will deal with one of these things, right? And so it's just a part of life. The other piece of it is that it's not just these big things that I just mentioned, but also there's a whole host of smaller things. If you're on a dating app and someone swipes in the wrong direction, if you are a student and you get a bad grade, if you don't receive a job offer from a company you're really interested in, right? All of these things happen. They happen much more frequently. And I think the good news is the skills and the behaviors and the mindsets that make you more resilient against these big things on the left-hand side of the page are the same ones that can make you more resilient or help you cope better with these smaller things that happen day in and day out. And so I think for all of us, whether we're interested in performing better at work, whether we're interested in being a better partner or loved one, whatever it is, I think resilience is one of the many skills that's really critical for us to all build as we go through life.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Chris. It's really nice to have a fundamental understanding of how you think through resilience before we tackle the rest of the questions here. So thank you. I think the next question is for Stephanie. And Stephanie, how are you helping people to redefine happiness, and why is this a need? How did you identify this?
Yeah, I just have to say, Chris, I love that chart. I think that's amazing. Well done on that. Especially enjoy the swipe right and bad grades. Those are real challenges that we face, and a lot of times they get minimized. And I think that's really helpful to frame it in that way. So in terms of why I believe it's a need to redefine happiness is that over the last 30 years, there has been an absolute surge in research that has looked at the psychology of well-being. Before that, actually, almost every piece of research was focused on how do we alleviate the pains and the sufferings. So a lot of the work that Chris is talking about was really developed over the prior 100 years. And that really makes sense because as a society, we needed to eliminate some of the pains and the challenges in order to move to a place where we could even start to think about happiness. But as our society, and specifically Western society here in the US and other countries like that, we have gotten wealthier and wealthier over the last 60 years, but happiness has not increased a single percentage point during that time. So we obviously have something wrong. We obviously haven't quite figured out what really matters. And while it's obviously incredibly important to figure out how we make sure we have enough economic and other resources to take care of ourselves, it appears that just focusing on our own personal success is not the path to happiness. But our society has told us over and over again that that's actually what we should do. And I'm sure many of you on the line can relate to the messages that you received, not only from your family coming from a place of well-meaning and of hope for your success and your flourishing in your life, but also from society, from our technology, from the media. Everywhere is telling you that you should focus on your own self in order to be happy. But countless studies have disproven this and actually point out that the secret to true happiness is to focus on producing happiness for other people. So this might sound really overly ambitious, like we're not all Mother Teresa. And I actually am not advocating for that at all. What we have discovered through our research at the New Happy is that there's actually a perfect intersection between your own needs and the needs of the world. And finding that is the secret to happiness. So if you can discover the thing that makes you feel most alive, the thing that makes you feel the happiest, and then use that in service to the world in some way, whether that's to your community, to your family, to your company, to the people around you, to a broader world, like in terms of government or other civic engagement roles, we all have a part that we can play in making the world better. That is actually the scientifically proven path to happiness. And we are working to hopefully inspire and educate and motivate people to discover this for themselves.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's so interesting to hear the story and the theories behind happiness, and you're right. Thinking through the history of the research, the elimination of, as you said, pains and suffering, and then moving to a place where you're creating a balance for yourself. It's a really wonderful image, and I can't wait to hear more about this. Next question, I believe, goes to Chris. So, Chris, following up on the last question, do you have a guide for becoming more resilient?
Yeah, so this is, I think, a helpful picture, and I appreciate you including it here. I think the first thing I would say about it is, with respect to a guide, is that everyone's path looks different. I think it's meant to look different. I think it should look different. And so what I'll share is maybe some broader points about what that path or that journey could look like, but recognize that it will be different for all of you, and that's a good thing, right? So in terms of resilience, I think what the science suggests is that there are really roughly 5 protective factors. In other words, there's 5 different things that, as you build them, as you develop more of them, allow you to be more resilient in the face of adversity. So I'll go through these, and then I'll step back and make a broader point about this. The first is your mental habits, right? So when something happens to you, how do you explain it, right? And we could spend hours talking about these things, but essentially, do you view these things as being permanent? Do you view them as being pervasive, as in everything is wrong in your life? And do you attribute it to yourself? Do you personalize it, right? Habits like that can be a predictor of whether you or how you will respond to adversity. Similarly, when something goes wrong, quote unquote, can you reframe it? Can you say this is a learning experience? Perhaps there's a silver lining in it, et cetera, right? And so your mental habits, your mindset matter quite a bit. The second broad bucket is your sense of purpose. So broadly speaking, the belief that you're needed, that your work is unfinished, that you have a reason to continue forward, and that purpose may change over time, right? This is something that comes through really strongly, and I'm sure Stephanie would agree with this as well, that your purpose and having that sense of being a part of something bigger is really critical when you're faced with adversity. There's a third piece around faith and hope. And again, some of these are more important to some people than to other people. But for many people, that idea of faith, not necessarily religion, but faith, the idea that there's something bigger than yourself and that you're supported by something larger than yourself, is an incredibly powerful idea, and something that people really draw upon. Then you have your relationships and your support. So again, no surprises here, but your relationships can be incredibly powerful. And for many people, this is a real source of strength. And then finally, there's what I would refer to as your resourcing. So think about your physical health, think about your mental health, think about what free time you have. Are you someone who can't spare a second to slow down and to think about things? Or do you have space in your life to reflect and to address what needs to be addressed? And then finally, thinking about your balance sheet. Right or wrong, money is important, money matters. And we know that all the statistics about the savings or lack of savings, and that limits your options when things go sideways, right? And so generally, these are the 5 different buckets that contribute to your resilience. Now, we all have resilience to begin with. We're not starting from zero. And what makes one person resilient may make a different person more or less so. Like, these things matter to people in different ways. But I think what's really critical in this is just looking at the right-hand side of the page. There are many, many different ways that you can build each of these individual groupings, and you put it together, and there are so many different paths, right? For some people, it's mindfulness. For some people, it's gratitude. For some people, it's their spiritual practice. For other people, it's their relationships. It's being in nature. We could go on and on. And I think the point isn't that one is better than the other. The point is that there are so many different paths you can go down. And I think part of the fun is figuring out what speaks to you and exploring. And in the process of that, allowing yourself to become more resilient and to grow and to change and all of those good things.
Thank you so much, Chris. Moving to the next question for Stephanie here. You provide so many tools for redefining happiness and one's personal lens through the New Happy, your newsletter, social media. Can you tell us a little bit more about the overarching theory or schooling that drives the creation of the tools that you provide for people?
Yeah, of course. So I think that I use a paradigm to help illustrate this, which is the old happy versus the new happy. And when you think about the old happy, that's what I just mentioned, which is the idea that our fulfillment of our own needs exclusively is the secret to your happiness. And the new happy, on the other hand, as I mentioned, is using your gifts to help make the world a better place. It's finding that win-win between you and the world around you. And I like to use this paradigm because I think that all of us have been through many different experiences of the old happy, which you can see on the left-hand side. And this is the one thing that I think we have all navigated this, where you say, oh, well, that thing is really going to make me happy. You know, it's a new job or a new apartment, or I'm going to move to that city I've always wanted to live in. Or once I get a boyfriend or a girlfriend, I'm going to be happy. You know, any of these narratives that we have, a lot of times they're actually not happening at a conscious level. They're going subconsciously and driving our motivation underneath it. And so what happens is we work towards that thing. So for all of you particularly relevant on this call and for pursuing your dream careers, a lot of times you actually will work for years and years to get to a dream job. And then you'll get there and you'll discover actually it doesn't align with your strengths, with your goals, with your passions. It's not what you thought it was. And then unfortunately what happens is a lot of us just tend to forget that and think, okay, well, I must have actually chosen the wrong thing. This was my fault, going back to what Chris said about personalization. It's something that I did wrong. Instead of seeing that actually it's a systemic challenge, which has been ingrained in us through all of these messages we've consumed all of our lives. And so what happens is then we'll go, well, it must have been that job. I'm going to go for the next big fancy job or the bigger apartment or the second car or whatever it is. And that just fuels this engine that we're a part of in our society. And unfortunately, you will meet many people who spend their entire lives following this curve, which you see on the left-hand side, and never actually achieving true lasting happiness. On the other hand, if you are looking to pursue your new happy, your happiness just grows and grows and grows. And as Chris mentioned, it's also protective for your resilience in the face of challenges because you have a purpose. You're working through a community and with relationships. You are using what's inside of you to make the world better, which is one of the most important things that you can do for your overall health and well-being. And that means that it just builds and builds over time. So this comparison, I find, helps people to think of a time in their lives when they've been through this and to recognize that maybe these messages we've received all of our lives actually aren't that helpful. And this paradigm is actually based upon over 300 studies that I have analyzed and consolidated into this framework, and my own research with people, talking to hundreds of people about what really makes them happy and what true fulfillment looks like. So now all we need to do is figure out how to adopt it in our own lives and help other people to adopt it as well.
Stephanie, just piggybacking off of that, you talked about the thoughts and messages that are sort of bubbling subconsciously. How do we become more aware of those thoughts of our subconscious to sort of get us to the new happy?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think really one factor which is really helpful here is mindfulness. So again, going back to one of Chris's protective factors, starting to notice your motivations and your thoughts as they're happening. One thing that I like to recommend that people do is notice when you latch on to something. Like when you are choosing a goal, why are you choosing it? And ultimately, every goal is designed to help you to become happier and to reduce your suffering. There's no goal that exists that doesn't have that as an end goal of the goal in mind. But just poke and prod a little bit about why you're doing what you're doing, why you're spending your time doing what you're doing. Because unfortunately, we are living in a world, and it's especially prevalent for all of you who are a little bit younger, that we are surrounded by comparisons. We are surrounded by narratives about how we should be and how we must be and what that looks like. And it's so easy to compare yourself to other people and to their paths when, again, as Chris said, this is all very much an individual thing. You know, your gift that you share with the world is not going to be the same as your best friend or your roommate or your siblings. And so I think it's just about noticing and then inquiring, getting a little bit curious about where this desire came from. Is it because you saw somebody else do that thing or have that thing and you think it looks kind of nice? Or is it something that's springing up from within you and starting to listen to that inner voice more and more? It'll get stronger every time you do that.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's so helpful. I think our next question is for Chris. Yeah, your philosophy is so multifaceted and thorough, and thank you for bringing us that last graphic to really help us visualize everything that you've researched and you're putting forth. How does one keep track of all of these goals and progress in all of these different areas?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So let me start by just echoing, I think, what Stephanie said, which is, I think having the ability to quiet your mind a little bit, the ability to create a little space between your thoughts and whatever stimulus is occurring, right? Like whatever's happening in your world and how you're responding to it. That's a really important skill. There's a lot of different ways that you can get there, but I think we all feel pulled in a lot of directions, and like there's so much happening right now that it's really hard to do that. A lot of times we are just bombarded with things, and so we don't make the space for it. So I think being thoughtful about that and being intentional about creating a little bit of that separation, I think underpins a lot of what we're going to talk about. I think if you struggle to do that, it's really hard to do all the things that we're going to talk about here coming up. So having said that, this is how my brain works, and this is how I think about actually doing some of these things, right? So first and foremost, I think you have to get clear on why you care, what your aspirations are. Because the reality is we all set New Year's resolutions. We all do these things. And the reality is that I think it's 92% of New Year's resolutions fail. I think I just saw that. Because life happens, right? So we have an intention to become more resilient or to become happier, and then life happens and it's no one's fault, but whatever is sort of your least prioritized thing is going to fall away. So I would always start with getting really clear on why does this actually matter to you, first and foremost. Second, I think it's really helpful to create a baseline, to understand where are you today, right? And so when I think about resilience, there's those 5 protective factors, and where I am on those is different than where Heather is or someone else is. And so it's helpful just to say, where am I today? And this doesn't need to be a long exercise, but spending 30 minutes and saying, where am I in terms of my relationships? Do they support me in the way that I want them to? And so on. From there, it becomes much easier to come up with a plan and to be able to say, okay, I know that there's a long list of things that I can do to go and become more resilient. So where do I want to go and play? What's interesting to me? What speaks to me? What would give me energy? What would be fun for me to go work on? And what's aligned with filling some of these gaps or building on some of these strengths that I've already identified? And so that map, and you could spend as little or as much time as you want, it gives you a plan. It gives you something to go out into the world with and to go collect experiences. And as you collect those experiences, then again, this gets to slowing down. You need to carve out time to reflect, to learn, and to say, okay, I tried the Headspace app for a couple of weeks. And what was my experience like? Does that mean I should go try Calm, or I should go try 10%? Or does it actually mean I should do something completely different, right? And that's the dialogue that we want to have. That's the time when you take those data points and you figure out, what do I do? What did I learn from these, and where do I go next? The one thing I'll add to this is that, again, life is hard, things come up, it's hard to stick to this. And so I think there's something to be said for commitment devices. There's something to be said for things like finding a partner in crime, someone, a loved one, a family member, a classmate, to go and try some of these things with, right? There's something to be said for saying things publicly. Hey, I'm going to go try these things, to hold yourself accountable. There's things you can do to design your environment, right? People talk about like putting the cell phone in the next room so that when you wake up, you don't check it first thing. There's so many things we can do to outsmart ourselves. And so I think it's important to think about those things. And I think it's part of being realistic about whether you can follow through on this. But the reality is that if you make a mistake, if you fall off your plan, then you just pick it back up and you've learned some things and you find a way to be better at it. But I would say that for me, this is the way that my brain works. I think for other people, it's helpful to have some version of this. It could be less formal, it could be more formal. But generally speaking, I think these are helpful steps to go through in the process.
So helpful. Thank you so much. Stephanie, the next question is for you. You've talked about serving the community and how community support is so important to building happiness and your platform as well. You've inspired so many people, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you've reaped benefits from your community members. So that might include your Instagram followers, your newsletter subscribers, your podcast fans, anyone within the New Happy community.
I love this question. Thank you for asking it of me. I can't even begin to describe how I feel that I have gotten so much more than I have given to the New Happy community. For those of you who are not a part of it yet, I believe that the community aspect is something that's incredibly important, and we do things completely differently than any other kind of like newsletter or media brand that I've seen before. I really feel as though what we have together built is really special, and would love for anyone who's looking for the people who can uplift them and support them in their journey to come and hang out with us. We would love to have you. I have reaped so many benefits, and I put this graphic together when I saw this question because I was thinking about it. And I truly believe that when you meet somebody, any interaction you have with them, you leave a little piece of yourself behind with them. And you can leave a piece that's beautiful and that makes them brighter and happier, or you can leave a piece that's neutral, or you can leave a piece that's actually detrimental. And I think that if we can all try to show up and to leave people brighter than we found them, we're going to change the world so much for the better. And that's what I have gotten from all of the people in our community. And as an example, not to put you on the spot, dear Alyssa, but I went through a really challenging time a couple months ago, and Alyssa reached out to check in on me out of nowhere as she noticed that I hadn't been doing a part of my work that I usually do. And not only did she check in on me again multiple times, which many people forget to do, she sent me a present so that I could take care of myself. And I just cannot even begin to describe how much those kinds of gestures really mean, and how when one person is there for you, it can change everything. And so having people like Alyssa in this community who are passionate about helping other people to be better is a gift. It gives me hope in the world. It gives me faith that we are going to be okay, that we're going to get through this, we're going to survive and make the world better together. So truly, I mean, I can't say enough about what I have personally gained from facilitating many of these experiences.
That's so nice. And it's such a nice story. So thank you for sharing, Stephanie, and Alyssa, for your part in it. And I just have to say, we at Grasshopper are so inspired by what you do as well. And you know, I've reached out to you just to get some tips and tricks on building community. And we noticed through your newsletter how good you are at tracking everyone who's part of the community and celebrating your community. It's always so nice to see. So thank you for role modeling that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Chris, you're up with this one. So I know this is a tricky question, but how would you be different today if you hadn't experienced so many of the setbacks that you have in the past?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And thank you to whoever thought up this question, because it was fun to be able to think about it and have a reason to sort of do that counterfactual exercise. So it is tricky, as you mentioned, right? I don't know definitively how I would be different, but let me make some observations about what I think is different in my life, and then maybe take a step back and talk about sort of why I think it's different and what I think perhaps this means for other people. So when I think about how I spend my time, my interactions with other people, what matters to me, when I think about all those things, I think there's a couple things that have become a lot more important. There's a couple things that are much less important or a smaller part of my life. So on the left-hand side, thinking about things that have become more important or a bigger part of my life, I am a much more patient person than I was before. I was an unbelievably impatient person when I was younger. And I think related to that, I was not a particularly kind person or a particularly empathetic person. And I think having some really humbling experiences and having to slow down forced me to become more patient, forced me to become much more understanding of what other people are going through. And I think as I got more of that, it encouraged me to really open my eyes and realize the more I learned, the less I really knew about what people were going through. And I think that spiral has actually been very helpful for me to realize that there's so much more that's going on in any given moment. I think similarly, we've talked about purpose a little bit, but I think when I think about how I live my life and the things that I choose to spend my time on, I have a much clearer sense of what my purpose is. Now, I should say I spent many years feeling like I was wandering in the dark, frustrated, struggling. And I think it's been through that struggle that some purpose has emerged. But I think I've gotten there, and it's exciting to be there, and it's exciting to feel like the work that I'm doing is really meaningful. When I think about the things that there's less of in my life, I am much less judgmental than I was before. Again, like I was not a particularly charitable or kind person. And so I think going through these experiences made me much less judgmental, and I'm very thankful for that. I'm also much less competitive than I was, partly because it was harder to compete, or I wasn't able to compete anymore. But I think also realizing that scarcity is a mindset, and it didn't have to be that way, and that I didn't need to compete with other people. And then, from an ability standpoint, going through these experiences did change me. Like I've struggled with memory loss and fatigue and a bunch of other long-term side effects that have impacted the work that I can do and how I live my life. So all that is to say, I think my work, my relationships, my spirituality, my habits, all of these things have changed. And I think in part because of these, or in large part because of these experiences. Now, the optimist in me would like to say that if I hadn't had these experiences, I still could have gotten to the same place. I think it would have taken me longer. Like I'd like to believe that I would have gotten there as I matured and had a family and grew up and did those things. I know that it would have taken me longer. But what I would say, and what I think is really critical, is I don't believe that people need to go through the experiences that I went through to grow and to change and to get the good things on this page. And I think that they can avoid some of the bad things on this page altogether. I think that for people who have the intention and who are willing to make the time to sit and to grapple with these things and to rope other people into supporting them on their journey, I think it's entirely possible to change and go so far beyond where I am. And so I hope no one takes that away from my story, that you need these things. I think for me, they were just really good forcing mechanisms. I had no choice but to deal with these things, to spend time on these things. And so that, I think, allowed me to get somewhere maybe more quickly. But I think we can all get to wherever it is that we're trying to go if it's important enough to us.
Yeah, actually, what struck me while you were talking is, especially when you were, you mentioned the self-awareness and the way that you've grown, and not necessarily needing to have these type of experiences to grow. Would you agree that one of the ways to look at this is kind of evaluating your values and what you hold dear, and understanding how they serve you? So I'm looking at the judgment and the competition. One of the ways that you might think about kind of lowering those on the prioritization scale is how do they serve you? Like, how does judgment and competition really serve you? I'm wondering if you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we live in a world where sometimes we do have to compete. Like sometimes school is a competition. Should school be set up that way? That's a different question. I have my own thoughts on it. But there are times when we do have to compete. We are judged against other people. I think being discerning, so being able to go into the world and say that's right or that's wrong, or I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this, or I want less or more of this in my life. I think that form of judgment can be healthy. Like seeing the contrast in the world can be a good thing. I think for me, I was way beyond that in terms of saying this is right and wrong, and I'm better than this person or worse than this person. And I think it was a very unhelpful mindset to have. But I think, just stepping back from that, I think you could get to that same place by going out in the world and spending time with people that are different than you, by spending time overseas, by doing charity type work, by volunteering. Like there's so many different ways that you could get to a similar conclusion that doesn't necessarily involve adversity or doesn't involve sort of that big reckoning. It could be something that you do that totally resonates with who you are as a person.
Thank you for that. Stephanie, the next question is, And I know a lot of our budding entrepreneurs on the line here are excited to hear a little bit about the startup world and how you overcome setbacks as a first-time entrepreneur. Because, speaking from my own experience, there are so many. And so how do you bounce back from those?
Yeah, what a great question. And actually, Chris, I want you to answer it after because you're in a similar position, although you've been doing this for longer. I think that I think that one thing that I really resonate with when I think about Chris's perspective on resilience and on how we navigate these challenges is taking what sounds initially like a really bleak perspective, which is life is challenges. Like your challenges are never going to go away. And that perspective actually was life-changing for me personally, because, and I'm not sure if anyone out there can relate to this, but I used to believe that if I could just be good enough or perfect enough or smart enough or get enough stuff, then I would eventually solve all of my problems. And then I would just have this blissful, wonderful life where nothing bad ever happened and I would just get to enjoy it. And it's really tied to the idea of the old happy, right? And that image that we just talked about, this idea that when you get somewhere, you'll be okay. And in fact, actually, you have to be okay in the here and the now. And the here and the now is just full of challenges, full of things that you don't want to happen, but that still happen. And it's how you deal with them that makes you. It's how you face them that transforms you, as Chris's story so powerfully illustrates. And I think that mindset was actually one of the most important things that helped me. And I will say that I was dragged kicking and screaming into that mindset. Like I was not at all interested in choosing that. It was the result of life circumstances and of learning to face the challenges that forced me to confront this. There was no enlightenment involved here. So I think that having that mindset, starting to view each challenge is, as I tried to demonstrate here, a way of growing my strength. And it was a way of helping me to be more of myself, to achieve my purpose, has been probably the most important thing. That's the more philosophical level of dealing with setbacks as an entrepreneur. On a more practical basis, I think that taking care of yourself is incredibly important. And when I talk about that, I'm not talking about things like, performative self-care or, spending lots of money. This is about taking care of yourself, taking care of your body, taking care of your mind, and taking care of your relationships and doing the things that give you energy, that give back to you. And I think that we need to do those practices in order to be strong and to navigate through these challenges, as well as so that we can be able to help the world. Because if you are in a position where you don't have the energy to continue facing those challenges, you're not going to be very effective. And so for me, I have learned through trial and error that there are a couple things that really help me in particular. The first is exercise. So any form of movement is absolutely essential for me personally. And I would really encourage anyone who struggles with stress or anxiety to pursue it. Those were two really big challenges that characterized my early 20s. And exercise, I would say, is the main thing that really made a difference there. And now it is the one non-negotiable in my day. I will do it even if it's for 5 minutes. I'll do it if it's 9 o'clock at night. And it really helps to keep me strong. And then the other one is really prioritizing loving and supportive relationships. So the research shows that the single most protective factor for your long-term health and your longevity is the quality of your relationships. And so investing in those in some small way every day is really, really good for you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Chris, feel free to, piggyback on that. And it actually ties into the next question that we had for you anyways, which is about, some of the biggest lessons that you've learned as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with all that. And what want to build on is the idea around taking care of yourself. And that looked like a little bit different for me, but I'll kind of walk through, I think, a parable that explains this, then talk about what this actually showed up for, or what it showed up like for me. So there's, many of you may have heard this story, but there's a story about, let's call it a consultant or a business person, but let's say it's a consultant, and they're on vacation and they go to an island. So they're on the beach and they're walking down the beach, and there's a fisherman, and the fisherman is sitting next to his boat, and he's smoking a pipe, and he's playing his guitar, and it's maybe 2:00 in the afternoon. And so the consultant goes up to the fisherman and he says, "What are you doing? How come you're not fishing?" And he says, "Oh, I already got my fish for the day." And the consultant says, "Well, if you went back out and kept fishing, then you could catch more fish, and you could sell it, and you could make more money." And the fisherman says, "Well, what would I do with that money?" And he says, "Well, you could use it to put a motor in your boat, and then you could go out and you could catch even more fish. And then with that money, you could go and you could buy nets for your boat, and you could make even more money. And with that money, you could buy a second boat, and then a third boat, and then a fourth boat, and then you could be rich and you could retire." And the fisherman looks at him and he says, "Okay, well, what would I do then?" And he says, "Well, then you could relax, and you could you could sit on the beach, and you could smoke your pipe, and you could play your guitar." And he says, "What do you think I'm doing right now?" Right? And so there's many versions of this story. Where I've gotten in trouble as an entrepreneur is the moments when I've forgotten about why I became an entrepreneur in the first place. So I went out on my own because I wanted more autonomy and I wanted more flexibility. So I wanted the ability to work on the projects that were interesting to me. I wanted to be able to help on the things where I felt like I could help. So to Stephanie's point, and I wanted the flexibility to take care of my health, to be there for my family, and to have balance in my life. And so that's why I chose not to go back to one of the big companies. There have been many moments, though, where an opportunity came up that seemed like it was too prestigious not to take, or where it paid too much money to turn it down. And in those moments where I've struggled and given into that, I've really regretted it. And in the moments where I've been able to remember why I did this in the first place, I've been much happier, and I think many good things have come from it. But I think what's really important from this is that there are a handful of people at most in my life who really understand why I've chosen to be an entrepreneur and who understand the decisions that I make day in and day out. For all of the other people, they look like the wrong decisions, the decisions that a good business person shouldn't make, and so on and so forth. And so for me, all of it stems from being super clear about why I did this in the first place. And when I'm good about that, everything else is easier. When I start to forget that, then I run into all the problems that Stephanie is talking about around self-care and around boundaries and around satisfaction and stress and all of those things. And so I would just say, if you want to go out on your own, just be really clear about what success looks like for you, and be sure that that's something that you're able to honor, and perhaps have a couple people that can hold you accountable along the way.
Thank you both. Now, I noticed that we have one more question for each of you, but I also noticed that we have a couple of questions from our audience that I would love to get to. And the questions that we had for each of you are around, if there is one, tip for resilience or happiness, what would it be? And if you don't mind, with your permission, I would love to maybe share that with the audience as a follow-up when I send out the recording tomorrow. If that's a-okay, I would love to give this over to Alyssa to moderate some of our audience questions.
All right, so it looks like we've got 4 questions. Keep submitting if you guys have questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. This first one here, Stephanie, should we strive for happiness or for contentment, and can they be intertwined?
Great question. The really nerdy answer here is that the way that scientists conceptualize happiness, there's multiple ways of doing it. Contentment is one way of thinking about happiness. There are other ways of doing it. I think that when I talk about happiness, I think of contentment as one pillar underneath it, but I also believe that happiness encompasses things like challenging yourself, which is not very content when you're doing it, or getting through challenges, as we've been talking about. So I think that, I would use the word that resonates most with you as your North Star. Again, as Chris has mentioned, this is all about you and discovering what works for you. I think that there are some people who I've worked with in the past who gravitate more towards a form of happiness that's based in contentment. So that feeling of peace, of being still, of slowness, that's really appealing to them. If that's the case for you, then contentment might be your word. There are other people who define happiness as pushing yourself really hard and striving to be your best self. And they're a little bit more on that end of the spectrum. So again, it's about actually just thinking, like, what does happiness mean to me? Because most of us, as I've mentioned, they actually just kind of swallow the narrative whole that we are given by society. So anytime you're just asking, what does this mean to me? You're on the right path, and just listening to yourself, trying things, seeing how it goes, and then adjusting from there.
Awesome. Great advice. This one, another question for you, Stephanie. Do you have any advice for internalizing the definition of new happy? This says, I feel like the need to chase my own personal success because it will make me happy has been coded into my brain. So what advice would you offer making that transition from old happy to new happy?
I would just say it is hard, and I really resonate with what Chris described here as forgetting. I've been thinking a lot about this lately, how, we go through our days and we learn a lesson like, oh, I really need to exercise every day. It makes me feel so good. And then we go to bed and we wake up and we have totally forgotten that lesson, right? It's this thing that we do. And I think that over and over again, we have to just continually remind ourselves and pull ourselves back. So if you think about something like mindfulness, where you're constantly training your mind to come back to the present moment rather than dwelling on the past or worrying about the future, it's about that discipline of coming back to, what do I want? What matters to me? And pulling it away from whatever the loud noises are that are going on. So I think of it as a practice. I cannot say honestly to you that I too do not find myself getting pulled into that narrative sometimes, despite having all the knowledge I have and having practiced it and having facilitate this community. So it's something that will happen to all of us. There's that level of the beliefs, and then there's the practice of it. So as soon as you start putting this concept into practice, you are going to notice benefits in your life that are immediately going to make you say, wow, I didn't know that this kind of happiness was possible. Once you have that proof in front of you, it's a lot easier to stick to. It's kind of like when you're working out and you're trying to build muscles. When you notice that you're seeing muscle definition, it's a lot easier to keep going because you've seen some results. So continuing to put this into practice and starting to tune into what matters to you, your gifts, and how you can give them to the world is a really powerful driver. And then the third piece is surrounding yourself with people, a community of people who support you and who are on the same path. So it's really hard to be somebody who's worried about making the world better if you're surrounded by people whose principal goal is how much money they're making or how quickly they're getting promoted. So starting to find those people who are like-minded and who share these values with you is really helpful for maintaining that discipline.
Alyssa, can I just add one thing to that? So I think that's an amazing answer. And I just want to build on the last thing that Stephanie said around role models or finding a community of people who share your values. This is something that I've struggled with and I think is hard as well. I think one of the amazing things about the world we live in, though, is you can connect with people anywhere. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to find those people, but they exist, right? And for me, what that looks like is I run a podcast. And so I interview someone every week who's been through some unbelievable amount of adversity, someone who was incarcerated, someone who's a Holocaust survivor, someone who was severely bullied, those types of stories, and talk to them about what was that experience like? How did you get through that experience? And how has it changed your life for the better? And so I get to have one of these conversations every single week. And I think the single most amazing and surprising thing about this for me has been that it's renewed my commitment to these values. It's a reminder every single week of the things that I care about. And it also puts in perspective whatever trivial challenge I'm dealing with at that moment. And so that regular cadence of it and the fact that I'm continually realizing there's so many people who have something that I can relate to and identify with is an incredible gift for me. Now, it may not look the same for each of you, but it exists, it's possible. And so I would just encourage you to find those people who make you feel good and make you feel like you're working toward becoming a better person or a better version of yourself.
Love that.
Really great advice from both of you. You hit kind of on one of the questions in the Q&A, but if either of you have anything to add. Stephanie, the part about reaping benefits from the community was super inspiring. What are some things to keep in mind if I want to make sure I only want to attract the right type of people in a community? Which again, I think you both kind of hit on, but are there things to watch for as you build a community, or advice that you would give to somebody as they start building their own?
I think I actually would really just echo what Chris just said. I think that if you're clear on your values and what matters to you, then you're going to attract people who share that. I think it's pretty easy when you do it that way. And you don't have to worry about people who don't vibe with it, because they're not going to be interested. Like there's a certain type of person who's going to go on Chris's podcast, right? They are somebody who has been through, as he said, a really enormous setback or a challenge that was out of their control. And I think it's about having that clarity of why and the bigger picture behind it that helps to bring people and attract people who share that value with you. And then helping to amplify it. A community is only as strong as its members. And so how you support the people in bringing out those values is the thing that's in your control and the thing that reaps the most positive results.
And for my younger college friends, I'd just add, just put yourself out there too, and that will really help you find your community. It's how I found Stephanie, how I found Grasshopper through Stephanie, and it's just as you start to enter the world and meet different types of people, don't be afraid to put yourself out there, and you'll build those connections along the way.
Yeah, can I just, Alyssa, that's such a good point. I just want to hit on something there, and Chris and Heather, I'm sure you can both relate to this, but if somebody emails me who wants help, who's a young person, I'm never going to say no, like ever. And I see both of them nodding. Like, people out there in their jobs, they are good people. They want to help you. So send a note and ask for it. Volunteer support. Just introduce yourself. You will be amazed at what happens. I use this strategy in reaching out to people for my podcast or to interview people who I have, no business reaching out to, and they respond. The principle is the same. And the sooner you put that into practice, I think the more amazing things that you'll be able to bring into your life.
So true, Stephanie. The hypothesis behind Grasshopper is that everyone wants to help, right? Mentors want to help, mentees want to help their peers. I've never reached out to a potential mentor who's turned me down. So you're so right. You just have to make that connection. I do see that there is one more question here, but in the interest of time, I want to be mindful of Chris and Alyssa and Stephanie's time. We will try to get to it in our follow-up. As I mentioned, I'm going to send this recording and some other information to all of you tomorrow. So just to wrap this up, thank you so much, Chris and Alyssa, for sharing your stories and your journeys and your tips for us. It's been so enlightening and so wonderful to have you here today. And thank you to all of our Grasshoppers who have joined us today. And thank you for those wonderful questions and for allowing us to get to know you. We also have 2 quick announcements, which I will again follow up tomorrow with, but we are launching an ambassador program as well as a campus club program. So more on that, and check out our website if you are interested. And in the meantime, visit us on all of our social media platforms at Grasshopper. And I will be sharing Chris and Stephanie and Alyssa's platforms as well tomorrow. So lots of follow-up to come. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.